Dr. Russell-Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to speak on the third reading of this bill to implement some parts of the Hong Kong-New Zealand preferential trade agreement. I think I want to touch on a couple of issues in this last speech on this bill. The first is some of the broader issues and problems with these kind of treaties, and particularly the investment clauses. And then secondly, why doing a deal with the Chinese Communist Party is particularly naive and stupid. In terms of the investment clauses around these treaties, currently there's an exchange of letters developing the investment parts of this treaty, but no doubt it will be very similar to the China-New Zealand treaty and be modelled along the same lines. And effectively, the investment clauses in these treaties, what they do is they lock in the existing overseas investment rules. So we can't tighten the overseas investment rules beyond what they currently are without breaching the terms of these treaties, the investment clauses within these treaties. So if we, as a democratically elected parliament, were to decide that we want stronger rules around overseas investment than we currently have, were we to change those rules, we would be breaching the terms of the treaty we've signed with China and the terms of the treaty through the exchange of letters that's very likely to be signed with Hong Kong. So in spite of all the rhetoric from Labor and National that they're concerned about the sell-off of farms, in fact what they're supporting tonight is a bill that locks in the current rules and means you cannot tighten the rules beyond what they're currently tightened. And if you look at Article 138 of the China-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement or 141, then you will see that that is exactly what that agreement says. We cannot tighten those rules without breaching the terms of the agreement. The second thing that I'd like to draw attention to are the clauses around expropriation. Now, in the China-New Zealand free trade deal, and there's similar parallels with the Hong Kong one, there are the clauses around expropriation. And what that means, and particularly indirect expropriation, is that if we tighten the rules around environmental regulation, with the result that a foreign investor in New Zealand loses money, then we are required to compensate the person for the loss of the value of their business. And these cases go to an international tribunal, which is decided by a three-person panel, and that panel can decide that in fact the New Zealand government has indirectly expropriated a particular business by changing, for example, environmental rules or tightening environmental rules. So as you can see, these treaties, what they're set up to do is to tie the hands of democratically elected governments to make it harder for those governments to regulate capital and business activities. Now, I have no idea why Labor and National wish to restrict the ability of democratically elected governments to regulate to protect the environment or to protect labour standards, but there you have it. Why you would want to sign up to a treaty that means that we can't tighten overseas investment rules to stop the sell-off of farms to overseas owners is beyond me, but that's what Labor and National want to do. Well, I think if you vote for Labor and National, then that's exactly what you get. The other issue, of course, is around labour and environmental. There's been much made of the side agreements on labour and environmental issues. We've seen these side agreements with lots of these free trade deals. They mean nothing. These side agreements mean absolutely nothing. Let's remember the Chinese Communist Party is right now locking up trade unionists who are independent of the All China Free Trade Union. There is a thing called the All China Free Trade Union, which is the Chinese Communist Party-controlled union. And if you step outside that and are an independent unionist, then you get locked up and put in jail, literally. And so these side agreements around labour mean absolutely nothing, because the Chinese Communist Party has made it very clear that it is extremely hostile to independent trade unionists, and people who we would consider, like the New Zealand Council of Trade Union, those people would all be in jail if they lived in China. Because those kinds of independent trade union activities are absolutely illegal in China, and you cannot do them. So let's stop pretending that actually somehow there is some kind of independent trade union movement in China. In fact, there are people trying to have an independent trade union movement in China. They're the ones who are getting locked up and put in jail. So these side agreements around labour and environmental standards mean very little. I think what really stands behind this kind of negotiation between the Labor and National parties in New Zealand and the Chinese Communist Party is an incredible naivety and maybe a willful ignorance about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party that Labor and National are negotiating with. Let's remind ourselves of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party that we're negotiating with in this treaty. The Chinese Communist Party has eradicated all political rivals. There are no political rivals. It's a one-party state. You try to do something different. It's eliminated the autonomy of the courts. The courts must implement the decisions of the Chinese Communist Party. It is not an independent judiciary. That is what we're dealing with in this kind of treaty. It has eliminated the autonomy of the press. The propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party literally every week puts out instructions as to what can be covered and what can't be covered in the media in China. The Chinese Communist Party that Labor and National are so intent on negotiating this treaty with has restricted religion. Of course, it's locked up the Falun Gong, and of course civil society is extremely restricted. It's centralised all political power. It has extensive networks of security police, and dissidents are routinely sent to labour camps. So this is the kind of treaty that the Labor and National Party are very happy to negotiate with the Chinese Communist Party for this treaty.
Order. Sorry to interrupt the member. I'm having difficulty hearing the member. Can I ask that the other discussions that are going on be at a lower level or out in the lobbies, please? Because I do want to hear what the member's having to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's very important that in negotiating this treaty we understand what kind of organisation it is that we've been negotiating with. And I think also we need to understand what it is that the Chinese Communist Party wants from New Zealand. Because what the Chinese Communist Party wants from New Zealand is raw commodities. That's actually what this treaty is about. The treaty is about getting access to raw commodities coming out of New Zealand. Particularly what they want to get access to is dairy and lumber, timber products and other kinds of commodities. The whole purpose from the Chinese Communist Party side of this negotiation to get this treaty, both the Hong Kong one and the Chinese one, which work in parallel, is they want to get access to New Zealand's primary commodities. So when other people say this is about something else, actually from the Chinese Communist Party side, that's what it's all about. Because the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party has been quite, I think, incredibly intelligent. That is, they've had extremely low wages, they've built up enormous reserves, and now what they're doing with those enormous reserves is going around and buying up commodity producers and natural resources all around the planet. So that's why we're seeing the current interest from natural dairy in dairy farms in New Zealand. They're trying to buy up these farms in New Zealand so they can send the commodities back to Hong Kong. Now, the treaty that Labor and National are so very keen on negotiating, of course, will facilitate the ability of natural dairy to buy dairy farms in New Zealand and export the dairy produce back to Hong Kong. Natural Dairy is a company listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and this treaty that Labor and National have signed with the Chinese Communist Party will facilitate the ability of Natural Dairy to buy dairy farms in New Zealand, because we're not able to tighten the rules in the overseas investment rules, because this treaty puts a ratchet on the overseas investment rules. So according to this treaty, we can't tighten the rules. So Natural Dairy has an increased ability to buy up dairy farms. And then, of course, make sure with this treaty that the goods coming out of those dairy farms that it buys in New Zealand are actually exported back to Hong Kong and ultimately China. Because from China's point of view, and Hong Kong is part of China, from China and Hong Kong's point of view, what they want access to is these kind of commodities, and they are in a process of buying up farmland all around the planet, not just in New Zealand, but all around the planet, buying up mineral reserves in order to get access to it. People may remember the controversy around Rio Tinto and the fact that Chinalco, the big Chinese aluminium company, tried to buy up Rio Tinto, or tried to prevent the amalgamation of BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto. That is that's part of the same strategy where the Chinese Communist Party wants to get access to natural resources all around the planet to get them back to China, which makes perfect sense. And this treaty is part of that strategy. And why wouldn't they? If you were the Chinese Communist Party, of course you'd sign up. If there's people silly enough in New Zealand to sign a treaty that makes it easier for you to buy farmland in New Zealand and get access to dairy products, of course you'd sign it. It makes sense for the Chinese Communist Party. The question is, does it make sense for New Zealand? And of course the answer is it doesn't, which is why the Green Party won't be voting for this. It's a silly treaty. We shouldn't be part of it. It's bad for New Zealand.